Before dawn on the 8th of January, 1815, the Louisiana swamp breathed fog. It rolled off the Mississippi in slow gray curtains, swallowing the cane fields whole, muffling the world into silence, broken only by the distant croak of herons and the soft lap of brown water against the levee. The air smelled of mud and rotting sugarcane, of gunpowder residue from the weeks of skirmishing past, and of something else, that electric, metallic stillness that soldiers learn to recognize the night before everything decides itself. To the south, barely a mile from the American line, 8,000 of the finest soldiers in the British Empire were already awake. They had conquered Napoleon's veterans in the peninsula. They had burned Washington to the ground. They had crossed oceans and continents without flinching. Now, in the pre-dawn dark, they fixed bayonets and formed ranks with the practiced ease of men who have done this 100 times and expected, this morning, to do it one final time before walking into New Orleans, and with it, the entire mouth of North America's greatest river. To the north, behind a mud rampart that barely reached a man's chest, stood fewer than 4,000 defenders. Tennessee and Kentucky frontiersmen who had never fought a professional army. Free black soldiers of the Battalion d'Orléans, Choctaw warriors, Creole militia, pirates. They shared no common language, no common uniform, no common background, only the orders of one gaunt, iron-willed general who had not slept properly in 2 weeks. His name was Andrew Jackson, and in the next 2 hours, he would deliver the most lopsided defensive victory in American history. The numbers seem impossible in hindsight. 8,000 against 4,000, Napoleonic veterans against frontier riflemen, brilliant British commanders against a self-taught general who had survived more disasters than most men see in a lifetime. Every calculation of military science said the rampart would fall, the city would be taken, and the treaty, already signed across the Atlantic 3 weeks prior, might never be honored by a Britain that held the prize. But wars are not decided by mathematics alone. They are decided by terrain, by timing, by the 10,000 small choices made in the hours before a battle begins. And on the fog-wrapped morning of January 8, 1815, Andrew Jackson had gotten every single one of those choices right. This battle did not merely save New Orleans, it forged a national myth, reshaped the political destiny of a young republic, and announced to a watching world that the United States of America, barely 30 years old, was not going to be easy to push around. Character 1. Context. The world that made this battle. To understand why 8,000 British soldiers were standing in a Louisiana swamp in January of 1815, you have to understand the world they came from and the world they were trying to reshape. Europe in 1814 was exhausted. 22 years of near-continuous war had bled the continent white. Napoleon Bonaparte, who had terrorized kings from Madrid to Moscow, had finally been defeated and exiled to the island of Elba. The great powers gathered in Vienna to carve up the map, restore old dynasties, and agree never to let this happen again. Peace, real peace, seemed within reach. But across the Atlantic, a separate war had been grinding on for 2.5 years. The War of 1812 between Britain and the United States had begun with American grievances, the impressment of American sailors into the Royal Navy, British support for Native American resistance on the frontier, and the barely concealed British contempt for what many in London still considered a bothersome colonial experiment. Congress declared war in June of 1812 with extraordinary optimism and minimal preparation. The results were disastrous at first. American invasions of Canada failed spectacularly. The British blockaded the eastern seaboard, strangling American commerce, and in August of 1814, a British raiding force marched into Washington, D.C. and burned the Capitol building and the White House while President Madison fled into the Maryland countryside. The young republic had been humiliated on its own soil, in its own capital. The national mood swung between fury and despair, yet the war had also produced unexpected moments of American resilience. Oliver Hazard Perry's naval victory on Lake Erie, the repulse of the British at Baltimore, which had inspired a lawyer named Francis Scott Key to scribble down the words that would eventually become the national anthem. Slowly, the Americans were learning to fight, but the British had not yet played their final card. In the autumn of 1814, with Napoleon defeated and the entire weight of the British military apparatus suddenly freed from European commitments, London assembled a strike force of extraordinary quality for a decisive blow against the American South. The target was New Orleans, the key to everything. New Orleans in 1814 was not yet the great city it would become, but it was already indispensable. Sitting at the mouth of the Mississippi River, it controlled the commercial artery of the entire interior of North America. 13 states and territories drained their produce, cotton, tobacco, grain, furs, down that river to New Orleans. Whoever held the city held the economic throat of a continent. A British garrison there, backed by British sea power on the Gulf of Mexico, could strangle American westward expansion before it truly began. More than that, British strategists had not entirely abandoned the idea of sponsoring an independent nation in the interior, a buffer state of Native American tribes that would wall off American expansion for generations. New Orleans in 1814 was not yet the great city it would become, but it was already indispensable. Sitting at the mouth of the Mississippi River, it controlled the commercial artery of the entire interior of North America. 13 states and territories drained their produce, cotton, tobacco, grain, furs, down that river to New Orleans. Whoever held the city held the economic throat of a continent. A British garrison there, backed by British sea power on the Gulf of Mexico, could strangle American westward expansion before it truly began. More than that, British strategists had not entirely abandoned the idea of sponsoring an independent nation in the interior, a buffer state of Native American tribes that would wall off American expansion for generations. The peace negotiators at Ghent, Belgium, were already talking. But British negotiators had been instructed to wait for news from New Orleans before conceding anything of substance. If the city fell, Britain would negotiate from strength. The treaty, initialed in December 1814, had not yet been ratified. Everything depended on what happened in Louisiana. It is worth pausing on this point because it illuminates the true stakes of the battle, which went beyond the city itself. A British-controlled New Orleans would not simply have been an inconvenience to American commerce. It would have created a permanent chokehold on the economic development of the American interior. The settlers pushing west into Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio, and the territories beyond needed access to the Gulf to sell what they grew and made. Cut off that access, impose British customs and British terms on everything moving down the Mississippi, and the great westward expansion of the United States becomes a slower, more constrained, more contested thing. The shape of the continent in 1850, in 1900, in the present, all of it becomes contingent on what 8,000 soldiers accomplished or failed to accomplish on a January morning in a Louisiana cane field. The British expedition was commanded by Vice Admiral Sir Alexander Cochrane, a ferocious naval officer who had personally ordered the burning of Washington. The land forces were under Major General Sir Edward Pakenham, brother-in-law to the Duke of Wellington, a veteran of the Peninsular War, widely regarded as one of the finest combat commanders in the British Army. His troops were not garrison soldiers or raw recruits. These were the regiments that had broken French infantry at Salamanca, that had stormed fortress walls at Badajoz, that had endured the grinding misery of years of Iberian campaigning and emerged, improbably, victorious. The 93rd Sutherland Highlanders, the 4th, the 21st, the 44th Foot. They wore red coats faded from Iberian sun and they carried Brown Bess muskets with the casual familiarity of craftsmen handling familiar tools. Against them stood Andrew Jackson, and the distance between Jackson's background and Pakenham's could not have been more complete. Jackson was born in 1767 in the Carolinas, the son of Scots-Irish immigrants. His father died before he was born. His mother died of ship fever, contracted while nursing prisoners of war. At 13, he was captured by British forces during the Revolution, and when he refused to polish a British officer's boots, the officer drew his sword and slashed him across the face and hand. Jackson carried those scars for the rest of his life, and a hatred of the British that never fully cooled. He educated himself, became a lawyer, moved to Tennessee, and built a reputation as a man of terrifying intensity. He had fought duels. He had survived being shot in the chest. The ball lodged too close to his heart to remove, and he carried it there until he died. He had waged brutal campaigns against Creek warriors in the South, culminating in the massacre at Horseshoe Bend that effectively ended the Creek War. He was not a polished commander. He was not schooled in European tactics. What he was, with volcanic certainty, was the most dangerous man in any room he entered, and he understood instinctively that battles are won in the hours of preparation before the first shot is fired. When Jackson arrived in New Orleans in early December 1814, he found a city in near panic. The population was ethnically fractured: French Creoles who distrusted American authority, Spanish residents, free black citizens who had built their own community over generations, enslaved people whose loyalty could not be assumed, and a transient population of traders and sailors who would join whatever side seemed likely to win. The militia was underfunded, underarmed, and undisciplined. The British had already landed on Lake Borgne. Jackson declared martial law. He pressed every able-bodied man into service, regardless of race or background, explicitly including the free black battalions who would prove among his steadiest troops. He made an alliance with Jean Lafitte, the privateer whose smuggling network along the Gulf Coast was an open secret, and whose men brought desperately needed powder and shot. He threatened to execute deserters. He was brusque, autocratic, and absolutely focused. New Orleans would not fall, he had decided. Now he needed a place to stop an army. Character 2: Preparation, the ground and the gamble. Between New Orleans and the British approach route lay a narrow corridor of land that nature had designed, almost accidentally, as a defensive position of rare perfection. The ground south of the city was shaped by the Mississippi River and the swamps that flanked it. To the east lay the vast, impenetrable cypress swamp of Lake Borgne, miles of knee-deep water, submerged roots, hanging moss, and sucking mud that could swallow a cannon whole. To the west lay the Mississippi River itself, wide and fast and unforgiving. Unforgiving. Between them, the strip of firm ground that connected the city to the south was barely 500 to 800 yards wide. An army trying to reach New Orleans from the direction of the British landing had no choice but to march through this corridor. There was nowhere to maneuver, no way to flank, no way to use the superior numbers that the British commanders were counting on. Jackson recognized this immediately. He had scouted the ground himself, riding out into the cold Louisiana rain on a horse that matched his temperament, difficult, powerful, and not easily controlled. At a place called the Rodriguez Canal, an old drainage ditch that ran from the river levee across to the edge of the swamp, he stopped. The canal was dry. It was straight. It cut directly across the only usable approach corridor, and the ground behind it was firm enough to bear artillery. He gave the order. Every available man was put to work. They dug, they hauled, they piled. Using wooden planks, earth, cotton bales, and the thick Louisiana mud itself, they raised a rampart behind the Rodriguez Canal that grew, over the weeks of skirmishing in December and early January, from a rough earthwork into a formidable defensive line. The canal in front was deepened, in some places to several feet of water and mud, an exhausting obstacle for men crossing under fire. The rampart behind it, known to history as Line Jackson, eventually stretched roughly 1,000 yards from the riverbank to the cypress swamp edge. It was not beautiful, it was not elegant, it was precisely what it needed to be. Along that rampart, Jackson arranged his batteries with the care of a man who understood that artillery would be the difference between victory and destruction. He had acquired, through Lafitte's connections and his own resourcefulness, a remarkable collection of guns for a frontier commander: 12-pound cannon, 6-pound field pieces, a carronade, and, most importantly, a pair of massive 24-pound naval guns positioned on the river levee that could deliver a devastating plunging fire across the entire width of the British approach corridor. These guns were crewed in part by Lafitte's sailors, men who had spent years firing cannon on open water and had a professional's steady hand. The force Jackson assembled behind that rampart was unlike any army a European commander would have recognized. On the right, anchored by the river, he placed his most reliable regular troops, the 7th and 44th United States Infantry, thin in numbers but disciplined and steady. Beside them stood the battalion of free men of color, largely Haitian-born, some veterans of the Haitian Revolution, organized and proud and bristling with something beyond ordinary military motivation. They were fighting for their city, their families, their freedom, and they knew it. Beside them, Beale's rifles, New Orleans merchants and professionals who had volunteered, sharpshooters all. Then came the Tennesseans under General John Coffee and the Kentuckians, the men whose legend would outlast the battle itself. These were frontier hunters, raised in a culture where marksmanship was not a skill but a daily survival necessity. They had grown up squirrel hunting in forests where a wasted shot meant a missed meal. They loaded and fired their long rifles with a speed and accuracy that European musket-armed infantry could not match. A British Brown Bess musket, in trained hands, could deliver 3 or 4 aimed shots per minute at effective ranges of perhaps 80 yards. A Kentucky long rifle, in practiced hands, was accurate at 200 yards or more. In the fog, across an open cane field, against men marching in close order formation, that difference was not tactical. It was catastrophic. On the extreme left, where the cypress swamp thinned to almost nothing, Jackson placed his Choctaw warriors, men who knew this landscape the way a man knows his own home, and whose role was to prevent any attempt to slip infantry through the swamp edge and turn the American flank. He had also positioned the schooner Carolina in the river to deliver enfilading fire down the British approach, and its bombardment of the British camp on the night of December 23rd had been Jackson's first deliberate blow. A night attack that caught the British entirely off guard, killed their advance commander, and served notice that the man defending New Orleans was not going to wait passively for events to unfold. The British, stung by that night attack and the subsequent days of probing skirmishes, settled into a careful advance. Pakenham was not reckless. He had seen what happened to reckless commanders. He surveyed the American line, assessed the artillery threat, and developed a plan that was, on paper, tactically sound. He would advance in 2 columns. The main effort would hit the American right along the riverbank, where a regiment of the 44th Foot was assigned to carry fascines, bundles of sugarcane to be thrown into the canal, and scaling ladders, enabling the infantry to cross the obstacle and mount the rampart. A secondary column under General Samuel Gibbs would strike the center and left. Once the rampart was breached, British discipline and bayonet work would carry the rest. It was the plan of a professional, and it might have worked against any other defensive position in North America. but it required the 44th foot to actually bring the fascines and ladders. And it depended on British infantry crossing the canal, climbing a mud rampart, and pressing an attack against men who had been waiting 3 weeks for exactly this moment. Before the main assault of January 8th, there had already been weeks of violent skirmishing that shaped both sides' understanding of what they were facing. On the night of December 23rd, Jackson had launched a bold surprise attack on the British advance camp at Villeroy's Plantation, striking with infantry, artillery, and the schooner Carolina in an audacious night assault that killed the British advance commander, Brigadier General John Keene's deputy, and threw the expedition's opening moves into confusion. It was exactly the move a European commander would not have made, attacking with an inferior, improvised force against a professional army still unloading from its transports. But Jackson had not wanted to give the British time to consolidate. He had bought days. In warfare, days are sometimes everything. There followed a series of artillery exchanges and infantry probes in late December and early January that revealed the shape of the contest ahead. The British brought up their own heavy guns and on December 27th and 28th engaged the American batteries in a sustained duel intended to silence them before the main assault. They failed. The American gun crews, trained and steadied by Lafitte's experienced artillerists and the regular army officers Jackson had assembled, absorbed the British bombardment and kept their pieces firing. The Carolina was eventually destroyed. British hotshot set her ablaze and she blew up in the river, but her companion vessel, the Louisiana, was saved by the extraordinary effort of her crew, who towed her by hand out of range, and she continued to provide fire support along the American left. The British had also made a significant effort to understand the American position through reconnaissance. Their scouts reported the depth of the canal, the height of the rampart, and the extent of the defensive line from river to swamp edge. Pakenham absorbed this intelligence, added it to his own observation of the ground, and concluded that the direct assault was the only viable option. There was no way to turn the position. The swamp on the American left was genuinely impassable for formed infantry with artillery. The river on the American right was controlled by the Louisiana. The front had to be attacked frontally, and that meant the canal had to be crossed. It was this calculation that produced the fatal requirement for fascines, and ladders, and the equally fatal assumption that this requirement would be fulfilled. The night before the assault, the British camp was quiet in the way that camps are quiet when the men inside them are not at peace. Fires burned low. Men wrote letters they were not certain would be sent. The regiments that had survived Iberia sat with the peculiar stillness of veterans who have been afraid before and learn to put the fear somewhere they can reach it only when they need to. The 93rd Highlanders, proud, disciplined, trained to advance in close order under fire without breaking rank, sharpened their bayonets and did not speak much. A corporal from Inverness wrote in his journal that night, "The fog sits heavy tonight, and I cannot see the American fires, but I know they are there." He would not survive the morning. In the American line, there was a different kind of tension. The frontiersmen cleaned their rifles with a methodical care that was almost ceremonial. The free men of color prayed. Old Jean Lafitte walked the line and spoke quietly to his gun crews, his French Creole a low murmur against the sound of the river. Andrew Jackson, gaunt and burning with fever he refused to acknowledge, rode the rampart one final time in the last hour of darkness, stopping at each battery, each company of riflemen, saying almost nothing. He did not need to. Every man on that line knew what the morning would bring, and every man on that line had chosen to be there. The fog thickened toward dawn. The temperature dropped. The cane stubble in the field south of the canal stood in pale rows, vanishing into the gray nothing of the pre-dawn dark. And then, from somewhere in that gray nothing, a rocket flared red into the sky. The signal had been given. Character 3, The battle. The storm breaks. Phase 1. The advance. The rocket left a crimson scratch across the fog and died. For 3 or 4 seconds, nothing happened. The silence was the kind that precedes not peace, but its absence. Then the British drums began. They started low, a steady pulse that seemed to come from everywhere at once, ahead, to the left, muffled but building. To the Americans crouching behind the rampart, peering south into the gray curtain of fog, the sound was almost more frightening than the sight of an army. You could not see what was coming. You could only hear it growing louder and louder and louder still. The crunch of thousands of boots in frozen mud, the clink of equipment, the particular mechanical rhythm of men marching in close order, a sound unlike any other sound on earth. Not the ragged noise of a mob, but the metronomic precision of a machine that has been designed to kill and is now in motion. Jackson stood behind the line, his hat pulled low against the cold. "Hold your fire," he said. "Not yet. Yet. Not yet." The British advance came in 2 distinct columns, separated by the width of the cane field. On the British right, closest to the river, Colonel Thomas Mullins led the 44th Foot toward the American rampart. They were supposed to be carrying fascines and scaling ladders, the tools without which the canal crossing was nearly impossible. But, in the dark, in the confusion of a dawn advance through fog and mud, something had gone catastrophically wrong. The ladders and fascines had been left behind. Whether through miscommunication, error, or simple chaos is still debated. But the 44th Foot was advancing against an entrenched position across a water-filled ditch with nothing to bridge the gap and nothing to scale the wall. They did not know this yet. Their officers did not know this yet. They marched forward in the certainty that the tools would be there when they needed them. On the British left, Major General Samuel Gibbs led the main assault column. The 21st, 4th, and 93rd Regiments, several thousand men in total, the best soldiers the British Empire had deployed in North America since the 7 Years' War. They moved in close order, as trained. They were exposed, and they knew it. But British infantry had charged through worse. At Talavera, at Salamanca, at Waterloo the following year, they would prove time and again that close-order infantry could absorb punishment that would shatter other armies and still carry a position with cold steel. The fog was their one ally. As long as it held, the Americans could not see them clearly enough to aim. The fog did not hold. Phase 2. The Wall of Fire. Just as the leading British ranks reached the outer edge of accurate rifle range, perhaps 250 yards from the American rampart, the morning wind stirred. Not much, not dramatically, just enough to thin the curtain of fog into ragged patches, revealing for the first time the full spectacle of the British advance. Row upon row upon row of red coats, advancing in perfect order across a flat cane field with nowhere to hide and no way to run. On the American rampart, thousands of Kentucky and Tennessee long rifles came up together. Jackson gave the order. The sound was unlike anything that had been heard on an American battlefield. Not the ragged crash of a musket volley, which was the sound of imprecise men firing imprecise weapons at roughly the same moment. This was something more disciplined, more terrible. Individual shots overlapping in a continuous roar, each one aimed, each one finding its mark. The frontiersmen did not fire in volleys because they did not need to. They fired as fast as they could reload and re-aim, which was fast, and they almost never missed. The front ranks of the British columns disappeared. Not disappeared, not staggered, not disrupted. Disappeared. Men fell in neat rows as if the ground had opened beneath their feet. Officers on horseback were targeted first. The Americans had been told, and needed no telling, that officers on horseback were the hinges on which formed infantry moved, and without those hinges, the machine ceased. Horses went down screaming. Men behind stepped over their fallen comrades and kept advancing, as they had been trained, because the only way to survive a storm of aimed fire is to close the distance and end it with the bayonet. But they could not close the distance. Not across open ground, not against this fire, not without the fascines and ladders to get over the canal. The American artillery opened now, the 12-pounders and the naval guns thundering in sequence, throwing grape shot and canister into the packed British ranks at ranges where every discharge swept down dozens of men. The sound was percussive, physical. You felt it in your chest before you heard it with your ears. The carronade on the American left barked and barked again. Down, down on the river, the guns on the levee laid their fire across the entire width of the field in long, long, sweeping trajectories. The 93rd Sutherland Highlanders, perhaps 800 men strong, the pride of the British expedition, had been ordered to hold in the center and support whichever attack was succeeding. They were standing in close formation in the open field, taking fire while they waited for orders that were slow in coming. They stood it. That is the remarkable fact. They stood there, in full view, under devastating fire from rifles and artillery, and they held their formation because they had been trained to hold it and their honor demanded it. But the price was catastrophic. Every minute they stood still in that field, men were falling, not one, by the dozen. Phase 3. The collapse. Collapse on the right. On the British right, the crisis point arrived with brutal suddenness. Colonel Mullins and the 44th Foot reached the Rodriguez Canal and discovered what they should have known earlier. The ladders and fascines were not there. The canal stretched before them, several feet of cold, cold water and mud, and the rampart rose on the far side. Close enough to throw a stone against, far enough that without a bridge it might as well have been a cliff. The men in front stopped, the men behind pressed forward. The formation compressed into a struggling mass at the canal's edge, and from the rampart above, barely 20 yards away, the Americans poured fire downward into the packed crowd. It was not battle at that range, it was execution. The men in the canal trying to force a crossing were shot from above and behind. Men who turned to run were shot from behind. Officers who attempted to lead small groups across were cut down before they reached the far bank. The 44th Foot, which had served with distinction in the peninsula and deserved a better end, disintegrated in minutes. Not because they lacked courage, but because courage cannot substitute for the means of crossing a water obstacle under the guns of a prepared enemy. Mullins would later be court-martialed for failing to bring the fascines. Whether that was entirely fair is another question, but the consequences of the failure were not in dispute. Jackson, watching from behind the line, felt the battle's momentum shift and pressed it. He sent runners along the rampart. Concentrate fire center-left. The left must not give. Keep the artillery working. Phase 4. The climax. The 93rd in the killing field. In the center of the British line, something extraordinary and terrible was happening. General Gibbs, watching his right collapse and his attack faltering, ordered the 93rd Sutherland Highlanders forward. The Highlanders had been standing under fire for 20 minutes already. They had lost men they could feel the absence of, but the order came and they moved. They advanced in close order across the cane field. Their pipes, if they were playing, would have been inaudible beneath the gunfire. They moved at the regulation pace, not running, not charging wildly, but marching, steadily, into the storm. The American fire focused on them. The rifle companies on the left of the American line, the Tennesseans and Kentuckians, who had the clearest angles, shifted their aim toward the advancing Highlanders. The artillery shifted. The carronade shifted. For a few minutes, the entire American firepower concentrated on a column of men who refused to stop. Men fell from the front rank, and the rank behind stepped over them without breaking step. Men fell from the second rank, and the men behind stepped over them. The column shrank as it advanced. It left a trail of red behind it in the cane stubble, a terrible geometry of fallen men marking the path they had walked. They reached perhaps halfway across the field. They could see the rampart clearly now, could see the smoke of the rifles, could see the faces of the men shooting at them. They were still moving. A lieutenant of the 93rd named John Cook, who survived, wrote later of those minutes. He could hear the commands being given on the American side, so close had the Highlanders come, orders called in English and in French, and in a language he did not recognize, all mingled with the continuous roar of the rifles. He saw the man beside him fall. He saw the man in front of him fall. He kept walking because there was nothing else to do, because stopping was the same as dying, and at least forward motion was the motion of soldiers doing their duty. The training that had made the 93rd what it was, the years of drill, the conditioning that turned individual men into a single disciplined organism was working exactly as designed, even as that organism was being destroyed. Then Gibbs went down. Shot from his horse, he was carried to the rear, mortally wounded, screaming orders that no one could fully hear. Pakenham himself rode forward to take command personally, and an act of extraordinary courage and extraordinary folly, the kind of decision a commander makes when he sees everything going wrong and cannot stand to watch it from a distance. Pakenham was struck almost immediately, first a wound to his arm. He kept going. Then a second wound. He kept going. Then a third, fatal blow. He was carried off the field dying and would be dead within the hour. The senior British officer on the field was now General John Lambert, who had been held in reserve with the fresh regiments. He assessed the situation with the cold clarity of a man who has just watched his commanding officer and two of his senior generals go down in 15 minutes. He ordered the advance to halt, but the 93rd could not hear the order, or could not act on it yet. They had advanced almost to the canal edge. A handful of men, accounts differ on the exact number, but some contemporary sources say fewer than 200 of the original 800 actually reached the rampart. They found no ladders. They found no fascines. They found the canal in front of them and the wall above them and the fire of the American line so close it left powder burns on the faces of the dead. They stood there for a moment that must have seemed eternal. Then what remained of the 93rd fell back. Phase 5. The silence. The advance stopped. The drums stopped. The fire from the American side continued for some minutes longer, covering the British retreat, and then that too subsided. From behind the rampart, the Americans stared out at the field. The fog had lifted entirely by now, and the January sun was climbing, casting cold light across the cane stubble and the things that lay in it. Red coats everywhere. A field that had been empty 20 minutes ago was now carpeted with the dead and wounded of an army that had crossed 3 oceans expecting an easy morning. No one on the American side fully understood what had just happened. Not yet. They were still alert, still watching for another attack, rifles still loaded and leveled. Jackson rode the line a second time, checking, his fever-bright eyes scanning south for any sign of renewed movement. He saw none. On the other side of the canal, the survivors were trying to find their units, their officers, their wounded comrades. What had been the most professional expeditionary force in the British Empire was now a collection of shattered men trying to understand what had gone so completely, incomprehensibly wrong. On the American left, things had gone differently. Across the river on the opposite bank, a British force under Colonel William Thornton had crossed during the night and successfully overrun the American gun batteries there. A secondary attack that had worked perfectly, that might have changed everything if the main assault had succeeded even partially. The guns on the west bank, briefly in British hands, had actually fired down the American line for a few deadly minutes. But without the main attack succeeding, Thornton's success meant nothing. Lambert ordered him to withdraw. The West Bank action, which had been the one genuine British success of the morning, was abandoned. The battle was over in roughly 25 minutes. 25 minutes. Phase 6. The accounting. As the guns fell silent and the morning settled back into the eerie quiet of a field after slaughter, the scale of what had just happened became apparent on both sides. Jackson walked to the rampart and looked south. The cane field between his line and the British camp was unrecognizable. The mathematical precision of the British advance had been replaced by the brutal randomness of its result. Bodies in rows where the ranks had fallen, and then in clusters where men had tried to cross the canal, and then in scattered pairs and solitary figures where men had made individual desperate attempts and failed. Some of the wounded were trying to move. The sound carried clearly in the cold morning air. Jackson walked to the rampart and looked south. The cane field between his line and the British camp was unrecognizable. Unrecognizable. The mathematical precision of the British advance had been replaced by the brutal randomness of its result. Bodies in rows where the ranks had fallen, and then in clusters where men had tried to cross the canal, and then in scattered pairs and solitary figures where men had made individual desperate attempts and failed. Some of the wounded were trying to move. The sound carried clearly in the cold morning air. The American soldiers along the rampart watched too, many of them for the first time truly processing what they had done and what had been done to the men advancing against them. A frontiersman who fires at a distant target in a forest understands the mechanics of killing, but rarely sees its full scale. Here, the scale was inescapable. One Kentucky captain wrote afterward that the sight made him fall silent for a long time, because there was no way to put the proper human weight on what lay in that field, and also to feel the relief of having survived it, and the two things sat in him at the same moment like stones. He said nothing for a long time. Then he gave orders for the wounded to be brought in and treated. Whatever he felt about the British, he had no appetite for leaving wounded men to die in a cane field if they could be reached. Behind him, his men were beginning to understand. They had defended the line. They had held. The most formidable army in the world had marched across that field and had not reached them, and was now falling back toward the lake. A Kentucky rifleman who had been fighting for his home, and nothing more abstract than that, stood on the rampart and watched the redcoats retreat and simply did not have words for what he was feeling. Later he would. Later there would be songs. But right now there was only the silence of the field and the thin smoke drifting north from the rampart and the January sun climbing over Louisiana. Character 4. Immediate aftermath. The aftermath. The cost of the morning had been savage on one side and almost incomprehensible on the other. British losses at the Battle of New Orleans totaled approximately 2,037 men killed, wounded, and missing in the main assault, a figure that represented nearly a quarter of the attacking force in under an hour of fighting. The 93rd Sutherland Highlanders, the regiment that had marched into the killing field with such parade ground precision, counted 557 casualties. Of the roughly 800 men who had advanced, barely 200 returned to the British camp unharmed. The 21st and 4th Foot suffered grievously as well. Total British casualties for the entire Louisiana campaign, including the skirmishes of December and the subsequent operations, exceeded 2,400. The American losses on Line Jackson that morning numbered 7 killed and 6 wounded. 7 men, against more than 2,000. The figures appear in every account written after the battle, and they remain, 2 centuries later, almost impossible to absorb. Military historians point, correctly, to the confluence of factors: the terrain, the artillery, the superior range and accuracy of the American rifles, the catastrophic failure to bring the fascines and ladders, the loss of 3 senior commanders in the first minutes, All of this is true and necessary to explain the outcome, but the numbers remain staggering nonetheless. General Pakenham was dead before the sun reached its full morning height. He was 37 years old. The wound that killed him was a grape shot or canister round to his upper body. Accounts differ slightly on the exact nature, and he died in the arms of his aide-de-camp shortly after being carried from the field. He had been appointed to this command by the Duke of Wellington himself, his brother-in-law, who would later remark, when he heard the news of New Orleans, that he might have done better to go himself. Pakenham's body was preserved in a cask of rum for the voyage back to England, a grim maritime custom of the era for commanders whose families wished to bury them at home. General Gibbs died of his wounds the same day, before the British camp had fully absorbed the scope of the disaster. General Keane, the third senior commander to fall, survived his wounds, but would not command in the field again that campaign. Colonel Mullins of the 44th Foot was later court-martialed for the failure to bring the fascines and scaling ladders. He was found guilty and cashiered from the service. Whether he was the primary cause of the failure or the convenient scapegoat for a plan that had multiple vulnerabilities is a debate that military historians have continued ever since. The fascines and ladders had been stored at a redoubt some distance from the 44th's position. The confusion of a night movement through unfamiliar ground contributed to the failure. But someone had to answer for it, and it was Mullins. In the days that followed January 8th, General Lambert took stock of his situation with admirable clarity. He had perhaps 7,500 effective troops remaining, though many were shaken. He was operating at the end of a difficult supply line in hostile territory. His senior commanders were dead or wounded, and the American defensive position that had just destroyed his best assault was still fully intact and fully manned. He attempted no further major action against Line Jackson. There was one final operation, a probe in force against the Fort St. Philip on January 9th, and continued operations against American positions on the west bank of the river. None of these produced decisive results. On January 18th, Lambert began withdrawing his army to the fleet at Lake Borgne. By January 27th, the last British troops had left Louisiana soil. The expedition that was supposed to secure the mouth of the Mississippi for the British Empire sailed away without having set foot in New Orleans. The city itself, when it finally received reliable word that the British were truly gone, erupted in a celebration that lasted for days. The mix of languages and cultures that Jackson had welded into a defensive force, French and Spanish, English and Creole, free black citizens and Choctaw warriors and smuggler sailors, all of them understanding, in whatever tongue was natural to them, that they had kept their city. Andrew Jackson rode into New Orleans on January 23rd. The city covered him with flowers. Character 5. Legacy. The echo of January 8th. There is an irony woven into the Battle of New Orleans that history never quite stops pointing at. The Treaty of Ghent, which formally ended the War of 1812, had been signed on December 24, 1814, 2 weeks before the battle was fought. Technically, the war was already over when 8,000 British soldiers marched across a Louisiana cane field and found 4,000 Americans waiting behind a mud rampart. It made no practical difference. The treaty required ratification by both governments, and the news would not reach American shores for weeks. The battle was fought. The men were killed. The result stood. And when President Madison formally ratified the treaty in February, the victory at New Orleans was already thundering through the American consciousness with the force of a founding myth. The strategic consequences were considerable, if not as civilization-altering as American mythology would later insist. Britain, having lost its expeditionary force and its most capable general, had no appetite for continuing the war. The treaty terms were ratified without the modifications that British negotiators had been instructed to hold out for if New Orleans fell. The Mississippi Valley, the entire interior of a continent, remained American. The great westward movement that would define the 19th century proceeded without the permanent British presence in the South that London had briefly imagined. The longer-term consequences were subtler but equally profound. The battle made Andrew Jackson the most famous man in America almost overnight. He had taken an improvised force of volunteers, freemen, pirates, and frontiersmen against the finest army Britain could assemble, and he had won with losses that defied calculation. The hero of New Orleans would ride that reputation into the Tennessee governorship, into the Senate, and ultimately into the White House, where his presidency would reshape American democracy, for better and worse, in ways that echoed for the rest of the century. The age of Jackson, of popular democracy, of the common man as political force, was born in significant measure on that January morning in Louisiana. For the British Army, New Orleans was a painful lesson in the cost of underestimating both terrain and enemy. The failure of the fascines and ladders, the rigid adherence to close-order tactics against aimed rifle fire in a confined space, the loss of 3 generals in the first minutes, these were studied and debated in military circles for years. The lesson that shaped the attack, that professional soldiers advancing with discipline could overwhelm improvised defenders, was not wrong in general. It was catastrophically wrong for this particular field, against this particular defense. That distinction matters. The British did not lose because their tactics were obsolete. They lost because a single man had spent 3 weeks engineering a situation in which those tactics had no room to function. The battle also stands as one of the clearest examples in military history of the relationship between terrain and outcome. Jackson did not win because his men were braver or his army was larger. He won because he found the right piece of ground, understood what it demanded, and built his defense around its requirements with an exactness that left almost nothing to chance. The canal, the rampart, the placement of the artillery, the positioning of the rifle companies, every element was chosen to maximize the advantage of defenders and minimize the advantage of attackers. It was, as the title of this documentary suggests, a masterpiece. Not an accident, not a miracle, a masterpiece. There is something else worth noting, something that the battle's extraordinary outcome sometimes obscures. The men who held the rampart, the frontiersmen, the free black soldiers, the Choctaw warriors, the pirates, the Creole militia, came from a society that was deeply contradictory in its values. The same republic that proclaimed all men created equal held hundreds of thousands in slavery, and New Orleans was a slave city in a slave state. The free men of color who fought and bled on January 8th would return afterward to a society that denied them equal rights. The Choctaw allies would within 2 decades be forcibly removed from their homelands by the very president whose victory they had helped to secure. The battle was a genuine act of communal defense. The contradictions it was defending were also genuine. History is rarely clean. The Battle of New Orleans is no exception. But the ground itself holds no contradictions, only the evidence of what was decided there. The cane field where the 93rd Highlanders walked into the morning is quiet now. Chalmette, Louisiana, that is what they call the ground today, is a national historical park, and on certain early January mornings, when the fog rolls in off the river the way it does in winter, the place achieves a silence that feels older than the city behind it. The rampart is gone, of course. The canal is a shallow depression in the earth. The sugarcane has long since been replaced by grass and monument stone. But something remains in that silence, something in the geometry of the place, the flat field, the river to one side, the swamp to the other, the narrowness of the corridor, that still makes a thoughtful visitor stop and look south and understand, almost physically, what it meant to stand behind a mud wall and wait for a red tide to come across the open ground. On the memorial obelisk at Chalmette, they inscribed the numbers, the casualty figures, the date. They did not need to say much more than that. The numbers said everything. January 8, 1815, 14 days after a war officially ended, the most decisive American defensive victory in history was fought in a Louisiana cane field by men who had no professional reason to win and every human reason to hold. They held. The British came with an empire's confidence and left with an empire's wound. The Americans waited behind a wall of mud and earth and defended something they had not yet fully built, a nation still rough at its edges, still uncertain of its own nature, still working out the distance between its ideals and its realities. They defended it with rifles and artillery and 4,000 men who refused to move. Centuries later, the battle belongs to the fog and the silence and the stubborn geometry of a piece of ground that one man had the genius to recognize as his.